I'm going to pick up on your comment about having to change behavior in order to be able to change the physical environment. I think that's very insightful. And it strikes me that the whole notion of the 15-minute city framework is not just a concept, but it's a behavior changer, because really it captures what urban designers have been talking about for years, which is complete communities. But complete communities is very abstract and amorphous. Like you can talk about it, but what is it? Whereas 15-minute C seems much more tangible. So actually able to shape behavior. So I think that comment about behavior is a very powerful one. So I think we'll go to questions now. And these are questions that have come to us from mayors and others. To Alain first, why do you think the 15-minute city model is important and effective for cities in dealing with climate change? This is the million-dollar question.
It's a very interesting question. The first thing is to say, I think, where the emissions come from. So we know that the vast majority of the GHG emission come from the city's built environment, their transport system, as well as the lifestyle and the consumption habit of their inhabitants. And on the last part, even if we don't account enough these emissions, we know they are very, very important. So as urbanization continues to grow and should reach approximately 70% of the world population by 2050, and don't get me wrong, we think it's a good thing. It's not a bad thing. Demographic growth might be a problem. Urban growth is maybe not a problem, right, because we know
density is good.
Exactly. So I think it's important to say. So if we consider that it is very important, it's clear that we need to harness a model of urban development, urban regeneration that is not only low carbon and resilience, but it's also thriving and inclusive for the local community. It's the only way we can scale it up and replicate it across the world, and we need to accelerate. And especially the latest IPCC report highlights the importance of this integrated urban planning to reduce emission. They say, and it's a very important number, because they say a good urban planning could cut approximately 25% of the emissions through compact, resource-efficient, mixed-use cities. And it's important because in most of the case, when we account the emission, it's only through sectoral approach. But it's the first time, at least from what I know, that we have this integrated approach and the importance of urban planning. And the report especially places a particular emphasis on the concept of the 15-minute cities. And why? Because it reduces, obviously, emission from transport by promoting people-centered street, active mobility, and more. It's also, and it's important to say it also reduces building-related emission because it makes the case for compact, mixed-use cities and a better use of the existing built environment, as many other speakers say. It's also a very effective way to tackle consumption-based emission and foster more sustainable lifestyle, because neighborhood is the perfect scale to act on behavior change. People shop in their immediate vicinity, and as the hybrid working will grow, we can really expect the nearby environment to play an increasingly important role in the people's life. And if we provide the local facilities that can equip the local community to adopt a more low-emission lifestyle, such as carpool apps, lending library, other shared services that can replace individual goods, zero waste store, and more other things, it's really with these facilities that could help people to transform their way of living. Most of the people want to change, but they need to be equipped with the right facilities and infrastructure. And it's also at the neighborhood scale that we can engage with the citizens. Initiatives such as the budgeting, the participatory budgeting, citizen assembly, they work much better when they are at this scale, at the local level, because it's only that way that we can focus on tangible action that directly relate to the people's everyday life. And I think it's important to say that this concept has direct impact on emission, but it can also be a great catalyst for change, because it proposes a positive vision of an ecological society that both the leaders and citizens can strive for. And this is why we have seen so many mayors endorsing, embracing these concepts. And I can, from what I know, my experience at the office of Anne Hidalgo in Paris, it was very interesting when she was fighting individual cars and everything. It was always before through the narrative of the threat, climate change, air pollution, and everything. Through this framework of the 15-minute city, she proposed a real vision of what these policies can bring to the people. And I think it was for this reason, it was very well received. And the last thing I wanted to say, it's also, I think it's important to say, most of the people say, okay, 15-minute cities it's just good sense. There is nothing new there. But I think it's important to say it's not true. It's not true. It's actually in a sharp contrast to the urban planning paradigm that have dominated the past century, which have really seen a specialization of the neighborhood with residential area separated from business district.
It's a classic modern planning.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there is really a form of revolution here. And I think the mayors have really understood this.
Can you tell us how cities around the world are implementing the concept on the ground? What are you seeing in your travels and in your consulting?
It's very important because most of the people say, okay, but what are they doing? How do they implement on the ground? And I think there is several things that are happening. First, it's important to say it takes several different names. 15-minute cities can be used in Paris and everything. Some city will use complete neighborhood, 20-minute neighborhood in Melbourne. The super block in Barcelona is very related to this vital neighborhood in Bogota. And I think what these cities have done first is to include this concept in their strategy and also in their urban planning policies. And actually urban planning policies, so for example, if you take Paris and Bogota, which are two key cities, they have no really include this polycentric vision of the cities made of multiple complete neighborhood. They have really transformed their urban planning policy to integrate this. And this is a game changing because, for example, we work with cities to work on their climate action plan. Climate action plan is great, but I would say it's not legally binding. Urban planning policies, they are. So when you start to incorporate that in your urban planning policies, land use zone and everything, it makes a huge difference. Then there is a lot of action from, and Carlos mentioned it, from economic revitalization that help to find retailers, commerce in vacant shop. You can see example in Melbourne, in Paris as well. Transformation of the public space, Barcelona and Milan or Bogota and Buenos Aires are great example. It's also about really trying to use schools and other equipment to propose multi-services and multi-use for the inhabitants. An example in New York, for example, where I was living before, New York, all of the public school, they are used, not all, it's not true, but many public schools, they are used over the weekend for many other purposes, for public food market, for you can rent the gymnasium of your school for your kid's birthday. You can, there is chess tournament and everything. In the city where I live in Paris, it was a form of revolution to do this type of thing. So this type of really small things can make a difference. And I think from the urban planning policies to this addition of coordinated project, you can make a real difference. And many cities are doing this.
How do you envision the role of new technologies in supporting the development of 15-minute cities, autonomous mobility, AI-based city planning, so as it will impact how we come to terms with climate change?
It's a good question. Yeah, I think there's a number of, when we say technology, it can mean many different things, of course. And I think we've talked a bit about that today already. I think the first part, as we've alluded to, when it comes to things like AI-driven planning, that can really help us when it comes to decision making and visualizing data. I think that can help us see patterns which might be difficult for humans to see, to make sense of large data sets. But then when it also comes, and we talk, I mean, Sage also talked a bit about some of the interfaces that DBF are working on. I think that's where things like how we visualize data and user-friendly interfaces are going to become super important. Also, how we create access to the tools as well, which we also alluded to earlier. So I think there's a whole valuable area around decision making. But I think the other side, and also to pick up on what Brian was talking about, is the new kinds of services and experiences that technology enables. And yeah, we hear a lot about autonomous mobility. We have over the last few years. Now it's become more of a reality than it was even sort of five years ago. We see some of these vehicles being prototyped and trundling around on streets around the world. I think the bigger opportunity here is to actually then not just to say autonomous mobility will kind of solve all our problems and it's green and emissionless and etc. It's an opportunity to really, because also that doesn't necessarily guarantee that they're going to be taken up by people that live in places where these things will be trundling around. So I think there's two things here. One is it's super important to get under the skin of who's going to use these things, where are they going, what kind of journeys are they making, why are they traveling, so that we can really unpack the why behind it and then design these services and experiences accordingly. And secondly, there's going to need to be infrastructure to enable these things as well. So how do we design a street to support an autonomous vehicle? But not only that, I would say there's a bigger opportunity there to then rethink, well, what is the street meant to be doing in the first place? We've designed streets for cars for so long, and now we've got things like autonomous mobility coming along. That's an opportunity to kind of flip the script and say, well, what are we designing? Who are we designing a street for in the first place? And take that approach and use the technology as a bit of a Trojan horse to that broader discussion.
How do you see the 15-minute city framework move this forward?
I think one of the prior speakers, mentioned it as almost as a simplifier, right, of a bunch of different interconnected notions. So a set of targets, climate targets, a set of new behaviors, a set of new types of spaces, all of that. And I think one of the challenges is always, how do you take something that is so overwhelming, like the need to radically transform how we live, and make it something that is first and foremost not technocratic, and second of all, something that we can all participate in and have an interpretation of. And so I like the fuzziness of the 15-minute city, or as we talk about it here in Detroit, 20-minute neighborhoods. But as I was describing in my comments, I also think it really means that, you can't take our city and shrink it down to a 15-minute city without also rethinking the restaurants and the dry cleaners and the hardware stores and the libraries and the logistics and everything else, right? And so even to pick up on what Chris was saying, if we look at something simple like autonomous mobility, there are all sorts of proposals about what happens when, say, a little delivery bot is out on the street and the benefits that you can get from that and the trade-offs that you might have to make for it. I personally have seen little to almost really no investigation of what that interface actually looks like at the facade of a building. So if we're now shooting a bunch of
or at the
delivery
facade
robots,
of a sidewalk and in pedestrian.
Exactly. So if we're shooting a bunch of robots out of a building onto a sidewalk, that's going to be a fundamentally new interaction that people experience in cities. And it's probably a bad one as a starting point. So, I think there's a lot of really fine-grained questions that need to be resolved after you get past kind of the high-level idea of a 15-minute city.
Yes, I guess I'll start with, we have not successfully done that in Boston. This is an ongoing battle. I will say in Boston, I think maybe similar to other global cities, every single small positive intervention we try to do becomes literal hand-to-hand combat over every single parking spot.
NIMBY combat.
Yes, and our active transportation director, Stephanie Suskin, she has pages and pages upon notes of the countless times she's talked to every single business owner on Tremont Street before we've implemented, a protected bike lane, which is still in construction today. And I think it becomes this potentially extremely beleaguered process in which, me coming in as a new person to the administration, I find that we need to completely shift the Overton window on what type of community engagement we should be doing for things that we know are proven solutions for climate and for a better urban design. Maybe one piece of advice that someone shared with me recently that I'll pass on to this audience in this group is a quote from the mayor of Pontevedra in Spain, Miguel Ancho. He says, and I've tried to write it into Michelle's remarks when I'm preparing her for various speaking opportunities. He says, "It's not my duty as mayor to make sure you have a parking spot. For me, it's the same as if you bought a cow or a refrigerator and then asked me where you're going to put them." And I think that really reflects kind of my approach to answering people who think that their personal vehicle is a large pet that they're able to bring everywhere with them and have a spot for them anywhere they choose. And it becomes a little bit of a more incisive dialogue than just rolling over and taking it.
Yeah, and I'd add one thing to that. I think there's also a generational shift. I know my son is not interested. We live in a city in the Midtown Toronto, and he's not interested in driving a car. He hasn't gotten a license. A lot of his friends haven't either. So I suspect over time we'll see this as being a less trenchant problem in terms of opposition, but it's still significant. I'm wondering if we go to the other group members. Ellen, what are you seeing in Paris and when you were there, and what are your thoughts on the car and getting rid of it?
I think it's what is very interesting. I'm more from the political side. I think it's interesting to see how, because it's take a lot of courage for mayors to take this type of policies. And believe me, it's very harsh. The lobby of cars is crazy powerful everywhere. And I think what is interesting and what is important to say to mayor, that is, at least from what we have seen from Anne Hidalgo, when she starts her policies on, trying to develop bike lanes, close some of the key road in the city for the cars, like the Berge de Seine, La Rue de Rivoli, and other, there was a lot of pushback, mostly from the business, let's be honest, and I have to say also a lot from the wealthy people. But it created a lot of buzz and a lot of on social media and everything. And it almost cost the second mandate of Anne Hidalgo. But what is very interesting, and she has been reelected, including this vision of the 15-minute cities in their campaign. And that's important to say. It's basically she shifted the narrative around this policy to really have a more holistic vision of what is the city she wants to propose to the people and why it can bring to the people. So I think it's important. The second thing is also that the fact that all of the people that were saying before, that were against before, today nobody wants to come back to what it was before. And I think it's important to be brave, and I think history is going in this direction. So it's a question of taking action, and even if it's hard, it's political fight. I think it's worth it because we can really see that in Paris, but in all of the main cities. And it's interesting to see, for example, how in the COVID, a lot of cities were able to accelerate their action, especially with the COVID bike lines and everything. And now we are seeing cities all across the world making this temporary action as new permanent, and they did it with very quickly. It's also, I think, the question of the rapidity of action is very important. There is a need to deliver quick action to show that things are possible and everything. And we have seen a lot of very temporary action from the active mobility perspective, but also social cohesion, terrace and everything that we have all seen. And I think a lot of these actions are now being made permanent. And I think it's very important for mayors to see that, you know, first, it's something all of the mayors that are brave are facing pushback, but the history is definitely going in this direction. And after, all of the people was again in the beginning became to follow the direction as well.
Thank you. And I definitely want to hear from Brian, given that you're in the city that gave us the car.
Yeah, Detroit isn't exactly the place I'd want to look for ideas to think beyond the vehicle. You know, we have struggled to get bike lanes here, and the prior planning director was really strident in advocating for it. You know, one of the things about Detroit is that unlike Paris, London, and Boston, we're either a shrinking city or a neutral city at the moment from a growth perspective. And it was designed and built for around 1 million people, and there's fewer than that, maybe 700,000 here today. So we actually have plenty of space. We probably have too much space, and Detroit struggles to get density. But one of the things that I think we're learning here from other more densely populated places is that you can create that feeling of density if you think smart about a district or a street or, you know, these other units. And so the most interesting things that are happening here are really trying to almost create a starting point, a node that later can grow into something else. And there might not be a ton of housing or other things around that node yet, but if you can demonstrate in really simple ways the quality of life outcomes that are better, then that will attract other people, right? And so I think there's a question here about how do you, even in an existing city, how do you kickstart the transition process? That's something that I'm really paying close attention to here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot here also around prototyping and making some of these ideas real. So I think this idea of starting small, and we heard it a bit earlier in the panel as well, to test these ideas out. It could be something that happens over a weekend. It doesn't have to be permanent. I think we've seen some experiments on a grand scale in the last couple of years, like the various interventions we've seen on streets that have either become permanent or been adopted in the long term. So there's potential to kind of extend that approach and that mentality to test these new interventions and really demonstrate the value. I think there's also something here around thinking about the design process, and someone earlier mentioned consultation. I think sometimes that's a little bit of a perhaps not a slightly misguided term, or it's perhaps understood in different ways by different parties. I think sometimes traditionally there's been the tendency to come into a room and say, this is the idea, this is what we're doing, and we're trying to, it's a pitch. We're trying to pitch it to you, and we're trying to sell the solution. But I think the shift and the opportunity here is to actually say we can involve people early on in the design process through things like community engagement, user research, to actually really understand what are the challenges that we're designing for, who are we designing for, and then when it comes to actually then rolling it out, really thinking about how we prototype and involve people in the making of the solution and gathering their feedback, and also giving ownership to people that will ultimately be impacted by that. So I think that's a different way of designing with people than has perhaps been the traditional model.
There's one other question from a fellow named Radcliffe DeCanny, which I think is a really important one. And maybe instead of picking people, we could just jump in, and it speaks to how the 15-minute city concepts ensures equitable outcomes. It's sometimes criticized that these concepts spur gentrification and ultimately harm vulnerable and often marginalized residents and households. I've heard this criticism, and I'm wondering how this group would like to respond, because I don't think it's a valid criticism, but it is one that's floating around out there. Hélène.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think two things. First, what we see on the ground is that mayors focus their 15-minute city strategy on the most underserved neighborhoods. Not at all. This vision of the Parisian city center, it's absolutely not true. And what we see from Latin America to China to everywhere is that where they focus, it's underserved neighborhood. The second thing is, I think it's the reality that why well-equipped neighborhood would be only for wealthy or city center, wealthy neighborhood or city center. I think it should become like the new norm. Everyone needs to have access and everything. The third thing I want to say is also that I think we speak a lot about the mix of uses and fighting the specialization of neighborhood and everything. But there is a real question about a diverse mix of people. And I think that's both exactly the idea of complete neighborhood is not just about a mix of use, it's also a mix of people. And a good city is a place where there is a mix of people in each of the neighborhoods. That means providing a wide range of housing, social, affordable, but not only, it's also a question of size, typology of housing. So you have really the diversity of the population that is represented here. And there is a lot of studies showing that, even in terms of cohesion and everything, you need this mix of people to have a good neighborhood. And I think that's very important. So I think it's very important to integrate that in the vision we propose of a 15-minute cities.
Okay, thank you, Hélène. Then we're now coming down to the end. So as a last question for the summit, why don't you each tell us what you think success looks like for the 15-minute city framework going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think the 15-minute city idea is already successful in that it's a way of making ideas around urban design very human scale and approachable. And it just was amazing to put together the summit because everyone has an opinion about the 15-minute city. And so I think it's already successful. And I think maybe success would be like leveraging that accessibility to engage a broader audience of citizens or kind of voices around urban design and to mobilize action.
Yeah, I think success would look like this. A lot less cars on the street, lots of people of all kinds on the street interacting with each other and having lots of choices. That would be success.
I think it's also something about social interaction. I think we are too lonely in cities sometimes. And I think we need to, and there is a huge
crisis right now.
Exactly. And there is something called in Paris, les grands voisins, where they just created this idea of neighborhood, and there is everywhere in all of the city, like large table in all of the street where people can meet every month and have a dinner together and everything. I think this is this social cohesion part, which goes as well with the inclusion, housing. I think it's very, very important.
I have to completely agree with Hélène on this. The social inclusion part and the built environment, which really supports this in a meaningful, sustainable way, for me is definitely success.
Yeah, success for me will be to see how this one concept that gained attention in middle of the pandemic is going to be applicable in different cities with being true to their own context. And then, see how the future of our cities unfold, staying close to their own context.
In addition to all of the great things we've heard in terms of desirable outcomes from this group, I would just add that unless we see city governments reorganized around this kind of integrative notion of planning, this will be a generational win. And it'll disappear afterwards. So I'm really looking for institutional transformation that makes this the norm. Yeah.
Raising greater awareness of what it is that makes a great place to live and work and be in society, and actually place some of the real needs that have been massively overlooked, particularly for large swathes of society that have not necessarily been really engaged in the design process previously, and putting their needs at the fore. And we've heard things mentioned like like loneliness was just mentioned, for example, and well-being, mental health, all these sort of intangible outcomes that we can actually really start to put at the forefront of designing better places.
I think, you know, my idea of success will be, you'll see cities that will move from a focus on quantity to a focus on quality, that our love affair with mobility will give way to a recognition about access, and that we'll come to understand that every aspect of the city lends itself to these very integrated design opportunities. And the image I have in my head as I'm speaking of this is any one of the laneways that you see in Melbourne, Australia, which were essentially, you know, trash zones 30 years ago, and are now in many ways the postcard image of that city. This is all doable, but it's going to take vision, it's going to take leadership, it's going to take support, it's going to take patience. But incredibly optimistic about the potential.
Thanks, James. And thanks very much, panelists. This has been a wonderfully effective group of panelists in discussion today. It's really great. Over the past 3 hours or so, together, I think we've had a very effective multi-perspective discussion about the 50-minute city and its challenges and opportunities for existing and future cities for success. By now, we've all gained some very insightful ideas about how we can use a 15-minute city framework to leverage our efforts as city makers, researchers, and even city dwellers and citizens to bring about better cities, clearly. So again, thank you all for your contributions, and thanks to the audience for their interest and questions. I will now turn it over to Sejal, who will tell us more about what happens next, including how you can get access and share the outcomes of the summit, and how we can connect with each other to continue this conversation. Sejal.
Thanks, Greg. I would just like to reiterate, like, I think all of us, everyone who's been here today, we're all deeply inspired, and there's so much to think about deeply after the event. So I think this is what happens next. Maybe it's like too simple, but here are a few ways we can kind of take some of the ideas that we've developed and how we could bring it forward. So first and foremost, what we've experienced today, it will be developed as a podcast in collaboration with the 21st Century Imperative. So we will be sharing this after the event. We'll also be sharing the video of the event on YouTube. We're also going to open up a community group on LinkedIn where we're going to, it was impossible, unfortunately, to get to all the questions, but we'll post the questions on the forum, and hopefully this can be a seed for more discussion between everyone who's participated today. And then finally, let's collaborate. So we would like to open the floor. We share the contact information of the different speakers who are here today. So we hope that the discussion can continue. One of the ideas that we have is to do a collaborative white paper on the 15-minute city using some of the ideas that we've generated and knowledge we've generated today. So look forward to that. And if you're interested, feel free to reach out. And so with that, I would just like to add one more thing. I would just love to give a special thanks to Julie, who's really been the engine behind this entire summit. She's done an amazing job. And I think, I don't know, we'll just like clap. I don't know if it's like possible to hear, but I think we can all agree this has been a very like a world-class event that we've just experienced. So just special thanks to Julie. And with that, I would like to close the summit.
Thanks very much, Sejal. Thanks for all of your participation in the audience. It was a lot of fun and very informative and very inspiring. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.